Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Prosperous Nonprofit. I'm very excited to be here today with Ash Rogers, one of the co-CEOs of Lwala Community Alliance. Ash, welcome.
Hi, I'm happy to be here. Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah. So before we dive into all the things, I would love if you would just share a little bit about your background, your journey, and how you became, or how you came to your role right now as the co-CEO of Lwala.
Sure. So I started in this space right after undergrad. I um I I connected with a nonprofit that was doing volunteerism to various countries around the world. And my job was to coordinate those trips for college students and young professionals. And then with the revenue from those fees, then we would give small grants to local organizations. And so I got to do both sides of that. And I really loved working with local organizations, and I really hated coordinating volunteer trips. Um, and so that was my first kind of entry. That work was in Uganda. I really loved Uganda and was interested to kind of figure out how I could be useful and how I could go back in a different role. And so I went to grad school. Got a master's in public administration. I did some uh, internships at that time. I thought I wanted to work for the federal government as a foreign service officer. I went and interned in Malawi with the US mission there and realized I did not want to do that. And so after graduate school, I did a program called Global Health Corps, and again was able to do that fellowship in Uganda. I was placed with a local organization called Como Learning Centers. They also have a branch now called Nama Wellness Center, and I still support that organization. Um, and as my time there, I got to know a family foundation called Siegel Family Foundation, and I worked as their director of operations really early on when they were kind of figuring out their philanthropy and figuring out where they could have the greatest impact. And I had the real pleasure of being able to be part of that team as we decided that they really wanted their money to go to local leaders and then my job became to hire a fantastic team of East Africans who would do that grant making and would find great organizations. And I did that work for about 4.5 years. And Lwala was in my grant portfolio. And so so that's how I came to know Lwala. And I actually was pregnant at the time when they were trying to fill the position. And I took the job offer on the same day that I gave birth to my first child. And so I've now been with Lwala for 8 years on September 30th. So that's about a month and a half away.
You will always remember the date that you
It
accepted
is
the job
it makes
offer.
it very easy to remember.
Yes. Oh my gosh. That's awesome. So yeah, your experience has been very diverse, but at the same time, sort of very aligned. And when you took the role at Lwala, was it for that co-CEO role, or what was the first position where you started here?
So my title at the time was executive director, and the organization, my predecessor, as he was leaving, the organization had a more typical kind of nonprofit working in Africa structure, where they had an executive director in the U.S. and a country director in Kenya, and it was pretty like a hierarchy in that way. And the board wanted to recenter the organization in our founding. We were founded by two Kenyan brothers and their community, and they wanted an organization that had more decision making, more power and governance centered in Kenya. And so they split the executive into a executive director role and a managing director role. And my now co-CEO, Julius Mbea, was hired first as the managing director. He was on my hiring committee. And I very much joined Lwala because I was excited to work with him and his leadership. And then our task together was to try to figure out what really that meant to center Kenyan leadership, to create a governance and a leadership structure that really matched our values. And so over the course of several years, we worked on that with the board, changed both the board structure and our executive leadership structure. And then we asked the board to change our titles in 2020 to co-CEOs.
That's so interesting. And I work with a lot of organizations who have that sort of old school structure, 501(c)(3) in the US and the CEO or executive director here, and then country director in wherever they're working. And I'm seeing this shift quite a bit to this sort of decolonized model, like you're talking about. But then there's other organizations who are not there yet because they haven't figured out sort of like, how does this actually work? Like, what are the sort of practical implications of this? So what does yours and Julius's sort of day to day look like? Do you share all responsibilities and everything is a, co-decision, or do you have your own sort of sets of responsibilities?
Definitely not everything's a co-decision. That sounds real tough. I would, I feel like the best analogy is like a marriage where you have, at least in my marriage, I don't know how other people's marriages work, but you have some separate responsibilities. And Julius and I have our own portfolios of things that, like, this is in my portfolio, for example, is board development, bringing in new board members and kind of supporting the board meeting process, fundraising and communications, and then research and learning, and then the US side of the HR picture and US finances. And then Julius oversees everything else, which includes programs and operations and government partnerships. And then we do strategy together. So when we're working on our big strategic plans, those are decisions that we're grappling with together and having lots of conversations on. And global finance, which you're part of as well, kind of helps us pull all of that together. And there's pieces of that Julius is responsible for, and then pieces that I'm responsible for. And essentially, if something is in my domain, I'm the end decision maker. I often, if it's a consequential decision, I will get counsel and input from Julius, and I'll kind of bring him what I'm grappling with. He'll give me advice. He'll kind of help weigh the options with me. But ultimately, I'm the one who makes that decision for something in my portfolio, or I'm the one who takes it to the board if it's really a board decision. And then likewise with Julius, if something's in his portfolio, he may ask me to weigh in. I typically have an opinion about most things, and so I'll provide it. But ultimately, Julius is the one who decides how we're going to move forward on that particular area. And I think, we get asked about this a lot. That's kind of the structural way that it works. But there's like a soft way that it works, which is that we get along and we are pretty good at communicating and pretty good at being able to see each other's side. And I think that is often where these co-leaders, co-managers processes can just get really difficult, which is like, you can't make up for interpersonal conflict. And so you have to have two people that are able to work well together. And then you can build structures that make that work better.
Mm-hmm. I love your analogy, your comparison to a marriage, because I'm just thinking, like, in my home with my husband, there are definitely things that, like, I'm just responsible for, period. And there's things that he's responsible for. But you do have that partner to be able to, like, hey, I think I'm going to do this. What do you think about it? But at the end of the day, I'm making the decision, and I can think of so many things like that, again, just in my home, where I'm like, yeah, I'm the end decision maker, but I do ask for his feedback sometimes. And so I think that's just such a good analogy. And that makes it seem so much simpler than, like, oh, there's two CEOs leading the organization. That sounds very complicated. But there are so many facets of running a global organization that actually splitting that into two roles seems like it makes a lot of sense. Like there's no way one person can really do all of that. Like that's a lot. That's a big
Totally.
job.
You can't be, I mean, just like no one has the skill set nor the personality to pull off excellence in kind of the full rounded way that you'd ideally have a CEO. And often you have people then in organizations or even eras in organizations where, you can really tell that CEO skewed external and they have like
Mm-hmm.
really great external profile and partnerships in that period. Oh, but they really like there was some internal stuff that wasn't coming together or vice versa. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
that there's a big advantage of that, and also just having the wells of energy.
Mm-hmm.
We've been at this for 8 years, and it's real easy to burn out, and it's lonely at the top. And it's really nice to have someone else to share that with, and even to say like, "Ugh, I'm tapped out right now." Like, can
Mm-hmm.
you step up a little bit? Can I hand a couple things to you because I'm feeling like a bit overwhelmed? And so I think there's a lot of advantage to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Um, Interesting. And so one of the things that you mentioned was sort of in your portfolio as co-CEO is fundraising. And I always, when I'm thinking about examples of organizations that are doing fundraising really well, Lwala always comes to the top of my mind. And obviously, since we work together, I know the intimate details of all of your financials. But what is your like? How do you come up with? I'm not a fundraiser. I've never been a fundraiser. I've always been on the side of like, I'm just going to track the money once it comes in. But what does it look like for you as co-CEO, as an organization, to like develop a fundraising strategy? What does that mean? How do you determine what type of money to go after and where that money is? And like, give us like big picture.
Yeah, at a big picture level, and then there's some tactical tricks to it. But at a big picture level, it's first is aligning your model and making sure that you have a model of program delivery, of value addition that um, that is real, that's making a difference in people's lives, that you can measure and demonstrate the impact of. Um, and in Lwala's case, it was really important to us to build a model that ultimately had sustainability, that could be owned by the Ministry of Health, that could be owned by government, um, and that there's a real pathway to changing the system that has created the inequities that we're working against. And so that's one. It's just like you can write any grant you want, and you can kind of like really run yourself in circles, but you have to believe in what you're selling, and you have to spend time making sure that that product has real integrity. And and then once you have that, you have to protect it. Um, and that's when we come to like deciding what kind of money you want to go after and what agreements you're willing to put up with for that money. Um, and so that's kind of step one, like making sure you have something worth funding. and then and then looking at who funds that big idea. Like who is excited in Lwala's case, like who is excited about changing holistic health systems? Who is excited about maternal and child health? Who is already interested in community health workers or community governance or community organizing? Because it's those funders who are most likely to keep you on mission and most likely to give you resources that inevitably become unrestricted, which is one of our big goals, is to bring in unrestricted revenue. And it's a lot easier to convince someone who believes in the core existence of your organization and believes in your big picture model to give you unrestricted money than it is to convince an organization that, they're not really excited about health, but they, will fund this project or that project with you, or like they want to do this little wash thing over here, or this little, they will only do mental health or whatever it is. And it's really hard to build a revenue strategy off of small project-based money like that. And so we go looking for foundations who are already interested in our core model and in our mission. And one tactical way you find those folks is you look at the organizations, the peer organizations that you work closely with and collaborate with. And you can see their 990s and you can see the organizations that fund them. And you start to kind of build a list. You start going to conferences that are relevant for your sector. You look at the funders who are sponsoring those conferences, and start to build up a network and then a reputation, and then often funder referrals once someone's funding you. Asking them, who else do you think should be funding us? Who are you talking to? What other funders in this space are you excited about that you feel like fit, your ethos of philanthropy? And can you make an introduction for us, or can you pass on our resources and make a recommendation?
Okay, I have never heard that before, but like, I don't know why not. Like, why have I not heard of this idea of asking your funders for referrals? I mean, frankly, that's how we get like all of our clients pretty much is through referrals. So why wouldn't nonprofits do the exact same thing? Because like good people know good people. I've literally never heard anyone say that or do that before. That's brilliant. I love it. I also think the point about being really strategic and looking for those organizations who are already interested and have maybe even a proven track record in funding organizations that are doing the work that you're doing or that have a similar mission to you is so important, because I know especially a lot of startup organizations are just going to like write grants for everything that's giving away $10,000 or $50,000 here and there. And then, like you said, you can't really build a fundraising strategy on all of these little projects. You need really a more holistic approach that's going to fund more. And I think that's why it's so important to be strategic and not just applying for every single grant that you can possibly find. And I think one of the strengths that I've seen in Lwala is your ability to attract larger donors and donors who fund you for not just, a small project this year, but multi-year, and then renewals. Like they come back year after year, or, grant period after grant period, and continue to fund you. And so how has that come about? Has that been because of the strategy of attracting donors who are really passionate about your work, or how have you been able to do that for so long?
Yeah, a couple things come to mind. The first is creating a real relationship with the donor, and whenever possible, connecting on ideas rather than just connecting on kind of the details of your project. I think when I'm going into a conversation with a funder, I have my objectives of what I want to ask them, of what I want them to tell me about their philosophy of philanthropy, of how they see how health care should be delivered in sub-Saharan Africa. And I want to engage with them on those ideas so that we are in the work together, that I'm kind of understanding where they're coming from, and that we're speaking together about, great, like how do we solve this problem together? And that helps me obviously better position and send them a proposal eventually that really matches them. But it also puts us in the same work together. Like now we're on the same team. And I think that builds ownership, like they're owning the work that's happening. And on that same point of like building a relationship, it also has to come with a level of like intellectual integrity, maybe is the term for it, of like, and I think funders also, like, they are people who often deeply care about this work and have their own technical knowledge and experience, and they want to engage in real conversations. And that means that like we don't always as an organization agree with them, and we don't always say like, yeah, you're totally right on that. And I think it's really important to be able to engage with people, to tell them when you disagree, to have debates with them about real ideas. I think both I think people can feel the authenticity of that, and you're likely to end up with a grant that you are more happy about implementing, because you've really, you've kind of taken that courageous step to push back a little bit. And I think that that's something I've learned from being on the other side and working with a family foundation and being that person who's responsible for giving away money and feeling like, I remember my husband said when I quit that job for Lwala, he was like, just take it in now because you'll never be as beautiful or as funny as you are to people right now when you're giving them money. And it's a real point. And so you start to crave an authentic conversation with someone. And so I think that that's a really important point. I think a lot of times as nonprofits, we feel like we have to kind of fit our models into the paradigms of donors. And I think instead, we need to engage our model with their model. Like we need to put them up next to each other and like let them kind of grapple and speak to each other, but that we should be pushing back. We should be sharing our really engaging in debates on ideas.
That's so interesting. And I think that building that relationship can also potentially help shift that power dynamic where it's like, I'm just the poor little nonprofit worker asking you for money. And, I'll do whatever you say and I'll like jump through hoops. And, when you have that relationship. And I know I've definitely seen like some of the really onerous, reporting requirements and the
Oh
way
yes.
that nonprofit organizations have to jump through hoops in order to meet some of these funders' requirements, sometimes before the award, sometimes just leading up to them even considering you for the award. And of course, a lot of times after you've gotten the award, the reporting requirements. So does this, this sort of collaborative, the way that Lwala collaborates with its funders, does that help with that? Does that help to be able to push back and be like, honestly, okay, maybe wouldn't say it like this, but like, this request is ridiculous. How can we come to a different solution on getting you the information that you need while also not like spending 80 hours of our time? Does that help you be able to push back?
I think it does in a lot of cases. Stephanie, you know us well enough to know that like we don't hit this 100% of the time, and that we are also in a dance with with some of our funders,
Mm-hmm.
and have had very onerous due diligence processes. Um, and I think sometimes we've gotten it wrong when we should have walked away from the table sooner than we did. But I do think that that principle, it's the right principle. It's like you need to be able to engage in ideas. You need to have your own kind of boundaries and parameters about the money that you'll take. Funders have all sorts of parameters about the kind of grantees that they'll fund.
Mm-hmm.
And there needs to be equity on both sides where you're also having as an organization your own understanding of the type of money that you're willing to take and the type of funder that you're willing to engage with.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that not all money is good money? And have you at Lwala or in any of your other experience, um, taken money before that you're like, we really shouldn't have done that. This is for whatever reason.
Totally. I think one of the best skills you could learn as a nonprofit leader or as a fundraiser is how to say no to bad money.
Mm-hmm.
And Lwala's been on both sides. We've said no sometimes, we've said yes sometimes. But I think when we've said no to bad money, I have never regretted it. I've
Mm-hmm.
always felt like that was the right decision that actually enabled growth, that allowed us to stay closer to our mission. And so, absolutely, I think that's an essential skill, um, and one that also has ripple effects for the sector. If more of us did that more often, it would be harder for this, kind of funder behavior to continue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's such a good point in the way that it could potentially impact the sector. And I feel like overall there's just this scarcity mindset where if we say no to this money, then that's it. Like there's no more that's coming to us. This is our last opportunity. So we have to say yes. And if we don't say yes, then, you know, our programs will not be able to make that impact, but there's always more. And I think that like
Yeah.
we just think of this, there's one pot of money, and once the pot is gone, it's gone. But it's really not. Like money is an infinite resource. And I feel like not enough leaders like see it that way, I guess. And it's something that I've had to learn in my own business, like saying no to clients that I just knew were not going to be a good fit. And at the beginning I said yes to everybody because I was terrified, like what if nobody else like walks through these proverbial doors, like I'm going to go out of
Mm-hmm.
business. But every single time I've said no, something like 50 times better has come like right around the corner. So I just think that's so important for nonprofits to remember. It's like number one, it's not just one pot, like one finite pot of money. Like there's more where that came from. And sometimes it is better to say no. I think that's just like a growth point for all leaders though.
Absolutely. Yes.
So what do you think about, I've seen I think we've all seen this sort of trend lately with this idea of transformational giving, like a
Mm-hmm.
one-time, very large, oftentimes unrestricted gift coming to organizations. We've seen it with a lot of like a handful of very wealthy people in the US giving away just like massive chunks of money to organizations, which on one hand is fantastic because like, yes, we will take $5 million or whatever it is. That is huge. That is game changing for a lot of nonprofits. On the flip side of things, there's also the conversation that like, okay, well, now this one donor gave us all this money, so other donors think we don't need money anymore. So what's the response to that? I mean, we don't want to stop the big transformational unrestricted giving. And at the same time, we still need to show other funders like, yeah, we do still need your money. So how do you have that conversation? What does that look like?
Yeah. To start, I think we have to realize what's happening in philanthropy and the example that some of those philanthropists are having, which is that they're creating an alternative model. The old style philanthropy with, well, I'm not the name, but the name brand big box philanthropists that you know of,
Mhm.
they have built big bureaucracies. They've hired experts and they have built huge teams in order to deploy their capital. And there's and the cost of deploying that capital is quite high. And I think and the due diligence processes, the oversight, the reporting, the compliance that's been built around those is also quite expensive to the sector, not just to that foundation, but to the entities that are engaged. And so you have a whole host, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of nonprofit organizations who are doing fantastic work, who get audited every year, who submit their 990s, who or to whatever their tax oversight entity is, they have been due diligenced by somebody. And so you can piggyback what these philanthropists are doing or piggybacking on that work that's already happened and saying, great, we'll do a little bit of our own digging. We won't take any of your time. We won't make you submit a whole bunch of stuff to us. It's all publicly available on your website anyway. We'll find your 990 ourselves. Maybe we'll ask you for your audits, and then we'll give you a big gift. And the transaction cost of that capital being deployed is so much lower. And it's a practice, I think, in a real lack of ego and in an urgency to deploy resources. So I think first of all, you know, there's lots of critiques that come to those philanthropists too, that they're doing this wrong or they're doing that wrong, or it should be better in this or that way. And that's all good to be sharing. It's good for us to hold philanthropy responsible. And it's pretty cool. And it's certainly exciting when you're one of those organizations who receives one of those grants. But then, just as you're talking about, it also presents this challenge where you have your longtime funders, the ones that you need year after year, the ones that you need to be with you for the long haul, saying, oh, is there a place for us anymore? right? Like looking up the size of that grant and seeing like, oh, well, we only gave them $100,000 and this is millions of dollars. Where do we fit in? Um, and so I think one thing that Lwala has done is shifted a little bit from talking about, and this is where finance comes down to it, Stephanie, and where 100 Degrees has been really useful to us in helping us think not just year to year, like what's our annual expenses and our annual revenue, and then having funders kind of zero in on that, like, oh, what's your budget gap for the next 6 months, and instead putting together a bigger picture vision. No. We have a 5-year vision. It's going to cost $50 million or $100 million. So yes, we had a philanthropist come in this year. They gave us several $1 million. They gave us $10 million, it was $20 million. But you know what? Against the size of the problem, and the size of our strategy to defeat that problem, this is super helpful. We're so excited we have it. And we need you long term too. And if your money stays in, we're closer to that $50 million goal or that $100 million goal. If your money goes out, we've just exchanged a one-time gift with a enduring long-term partnership. And we're not further ahead as an organization. In fact, like we're probably further behind. So that's how we've tried to approach it, is to try to really like, let's think about the bigger vision here and where all this money fits in to the scale of the problem.
I think that's key, being able to articulate a longer term vision and the size of the problem. I love that you said that, because if we're just sort of in our day to day and, that's the way that we're talking about the organization and our needs, well, yeah, our budget is covered for this year. So maybe there isn't a need for you. But like stepping back and thinking really big, that's where we need to put on that visionary hat and really be able to share what that longer term vision is. And is that, when you think about like putting together a long-term vision, is that like a strategic planning process, or does it not need to be that like complicated where you're hiring this expensive consultant and putting together a strategic plan? Or is it just like, hey, here's the problem and here's what we want to do?
We've had strategic planning processes. We've never hired an expensive consultant. We have I think my internet might have skipped for a second, but I think I'm back on. Are you with me, Stephanie?
Yeah. You didn't skip on my side. I can hear you.
Oh, okay. We've not hired a big expensive consultant for strategic planning. We hired what I would say was like a coach for our last strategic planning process, who worked with us. I would say maybe like 20 to 30 hours over the course of a year. And so she provided some support to our internal team. She did some board surveys and interviews, and she helped us kind of keep a template together and keep our ideas on track. And then we did there's the online, you can find a 1-page strategic plan template. And that is what we use. We spend a lot of time working with our communities and having community-led processes in which community members were talking with each other to really grapple with, identify challenges, identify kind of hopes and dreams and what they would want to see the organization doing. And we spent a lot of time there. And we spent time then working with our boards to come up with 5 big programmatic goals and then 5 key capabilities, like organizational strengths that we needed to be able to execute. And then we costed it. And I think at that level, like having some directional goals, each of our 5 goals, I think, had 3 to 5 KPIs. So there's like slightly more detail to it, but not much. That's really the level of detail that's going to be relevant 3 years from now, and certainly 5 years from now anyway. And I think, these strategic processes that go way further in depth than that, unfortunately, maybe you get a lot of ideas and your team's learning together, and that's valuable, but the actual content itself will be different in 12 months. and you've put a lot of money and a lot of resources into details that inevitably, if you're a learning organization, if you're a growing organization, those details will change.
I think that's so powerful because I feel like a lot of times people get hung up on the process and on the details and on the expense. And like, I think you've just shown like it doesn't have to be expensive and detailed and cumbersome to be able to put together this big vision that then you can share that can help advance your fundraising and your revenue generation conversations and activities. And I think that's fantastic because I just think people get very hung up on the process and it really doesn't have to be this, this complex thing. Um, all right. Well, oh my gosh, I feel like I could talk forever. I'm just really interested in your perspective on fundraising and your leadership, but we will wrap it up. And I have just one last question for you. What does a prosperous nonprofit look like to you?
Ooh, a prosperous nonprofit is one that is community driven, that has values and has people in the organization that believe in those values, that are driven by those values. And it's an organization with happy people, that both your employees are happy, that your board is happy and aligned, and most importantly, that the communities that you're serving are happy with your services and are kind of pulling with you, that you're pulling together.
I love that answer. I definitely agree with the people side of things because our organizations would not run. We would not do the work that we are doing without the people. So awesome.
We're in
Well, Ash,
human services, so if our people aren't happy, then
yes.
we're not delivering a good product.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Well, Ash, thank you so much for this conversation. This was fantastic. And I think so many amazing takeaways for our listeners. If people want to learn more about Lwala, where can they find more?
They can find us at lwala.org, and it's spelled Lwala.
Awesome. Definitely. You guys have a great website, by the way. There's so much good
Thank
information
you.
on there.
Thank you. I have little to do with that, but I will pass on the compliment.
Awesome. Well, Ash, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Stephanie.